The scream cut through the noise of the market before anyone understood what was happening. Lena Doyle was arranging a basket of pears on her stall when she heard it, sharp and frightened, coming from the far corner near the fountain. She turned just in time to see an old woman stumble backward into a stack of wooden crates, her shawl slipping from her thin shoulders as she tried to catch herself and failed. Standing over her was a young woman in a deep green coat, her gloved hand still raised from the shove she had just delivered. Her name was Camille Rutherford, and everyone in Belmore knew her face, if not her kindness. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest merchants in the region, and she wore that fact like armor. "I told you to move," Camille said, her voice loud enough to carry across the square. "You were standing right in my way, you filthy old thing. Do you have any idea whose path you were blocking?" The old woman did not answer. She pressed one hand against the crates, trying to push herself upright, but her legs were shaking too badly to hold her. A small crowd had already begun to gather, the way crowds always do, drawn by the promise of a scene but unwilling to step into it. Lena did not think. She was already moving before she had decided to move, weaving between the stalls, her apron still dusted with flour from the morning's baking. "Leave her alone," Lena said, dropping to her knees beside the old woman and slipping an arm under her shoulders. "Can't you see she's hurt?" Camille's eyes narrowed as they landed on Lena. "And who asked you to speak? This beggar was blocking the walkway. She could have ruined my coat." "She's an old woman, not an obstacle," Lena said. Her voice stayed even, but there was steel underneath it now. "Whatever she did or didn't do, you had no right to put your hands on her." A ripple went through the onlookers. Nobody spoke against Camille Rutherford in public. Her father's warehouses supplied half the shops in Belmore, and it was common knowledge that crossing the Rutherford family meant trouble that lingered long after the argument ended. But Lena had already crossed that line, and there was no walking it back now. Camille stepped closer, her chin lifted. "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Lena said, helping the old woman find her footing. "And right now I don't much care. This woman needs help, not an audience." For a moment Camille looked as though she might say something worse, something that would turn the crowd's murmuring into real trouble. Instead, she gave a short, cold laugh, the kind that was meant to sound careless but did not quite manage it. "You'll regret this," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "People like you always do." Then she turned on her heel and swept away through the parting crowd, her green coat snapping behind her like a warning flag. Lena did not watch her go. She was already focused on the old woman, whose breathing had gone shallow and uneven. Up close, Lena could see that her clothes, though plain and travel-worn, were made of finer cloth than they first appeared, and her hands, though trembling, were smooth in a way that spoke of a life spent far from hard labor. But none of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was the thin trickle of blood at the woman's temple where she had struck the crate, and the way her eyes kept losing focus. "You're going to be all right," Lena said gently. "Can you tell me your name?" The old woman blinked several times before her eyes settled on Lena's face. "Eleanor," she said quietly. "My name is Eleanor." "Well, Eleanor, I'm Lena. Let's get you somewhere you can sit down." Nathan, Lena's younger brother, had come running from the bakery stall the moment he heard the commotion, and together they helped Eleanor to her feet. She was lighter than Lena expected, almost fragile, and she leaned heavily against Lena's arm as they made their way slowly out of the square. "I don't have far to walk," Lena said, glancing at Nathan. "Watch the stall, I'll be back soon." Nathan nodded, though his eyes lingered worriedly on the direction Camille had disappeared. "Be careful," he said. "You know how the Rutherfords are." "I know," Lena said. "But I couldn't just stand there." They walked slowly through the narrower streets behind the market, away from the noise and the stairs, until they reached the small stone house where Lena lived with her brother. It was modest, with a low roof and a garden of herbs struggling bravely along the front wall, but it was clean and warm, and Eleanor seemed grateful simply to be somewhere quiet. Once inside, Lena eased her onto the bench near the hearth and knelt to examine the cut on her temple. It was not deep, but it needed tending. She fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth without being asked, moving with the practiced calm of someone who had patched up scrapes and bruises many times before, though usually her own or her brother's. "This might sting a little," Lena warned, dabbing gently at the wound. Alina winced but did not pull away. "You did not have to help me," she said after a moment. "Most people would have looked the other way." "Most people are afraid of losing their business to men like Rutherford," Lena said simply. "I don't have much of a business to lose, just a bread stall and a temper I probably shouldn't have used today." A faint smile crossed Alina's face, there and gone so quickly that Lena almost missed it. "Your temper served you well. That young woman needed to hear it." "She won't forget it either," Lena said, finishing with the cloth and setting it aside. "But that's a problem for tomorrow. Right now you need rest, and probably something warm to drink." She moved to the small hearth and set a kettle over the flame, and for a while neither of them spoke. Alina watched Lena with a quiet, careful attention, the kind of look that seemed to be studying more than the room around her. "Do you live here alone?" Alina asked eventually. "With my brother, Nathan. Our parents passed some years ago. We manage well enough between the bakery and his work at the stables." "You seem very young to be carrying so much." Lena shrugged, pouring the tea once the kettle whistled. "I don't think about it that way. It's just life. You do what needs doing." Alina accepted the cup with both hands, savoring the warmth of it. "That is a rarer way of thinking than you might believe," she said quietly. "Most people spend their lives waiting for someone else to do what needs doing." Lena sat across from her, studying the old woman's face in the firelight. There was something in her bearing, in the quiet precision of her words, that did not match the simple traveling clothes she wore. But it was not Lena's place to ask questions of a stranger she had only just met, especially one who had clearly had a difficult enough day already. "Where are you traveling from?" Lena asked instead, keeping her tone light. "From the north," Alina said, which was true enough, though it revealed nothing. "I was resting near the fountain when that young woman decided I was in her way." "She had no right to touch you." "No," Alina agreed. "She did not, but I have found that people who believe themselves untouchable rarely stop to consider whether they have the right to anything at all." Lena thought of Camille's parting words, the promise wrapped inside the threat. "You'll regret this." She pushed the worry down, not wanting to let it show on her face, but Alina seemed to notice anyway. "You are worried," Alina said, "about what she might do." "A little," Lena admitted. "The Rutherfords have influence in this town, more than my brother and I could ever hope to have, but I meant what I said back there. I wasn't going to stand by and watch her hurt you." "Then you are either very brave," Alina said, "or very foolish, perhaps both." Lena laughed softly, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time since the square. "My brother tells me the same thing at least once a week." They sat together as the afternoon light shifted across the floor, talking of small things, the weather, the price of flour, the strange quiet of the streets when the market emptied out in the evenings. Alina asked careful questions, and Lena answered them honestly, without the caution she might have shown a stranger of obvious wealth or standing. There was something in Alina's manner that put her at ease, a warmth beneath the formality, as though the old woman had spent a long time being polite to people, and was relieved now to simply talk. When the color had returned fully to Alina's cheeks and her hands had stopped trembling, she rose carefully from the bench, testing her balance before taking a full step. "I should not stay much longer," Alina said. "There are people who will be looking for me." "Family?" Lena asked, helping her gather her shawl. "Something like that," Alina said, and there was a flicker of something unreadable in her expression, gone before Lena could name it. "You have been very kind to me today, Lena. Kinder than you know. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Alina said, turning to look at her directly. "They would not have. I have lived a long time, and I have learned the difference between kindness that is performed and kindness that is simply who a person is. Yours is the second kind. It is rarer than you think." Lena did not know how to answer that, so she simply walked Alina to the door and offered to accompany her part way. But Alina gently refused, insisting she would manage on her own now that her strength had returned. "Will I see you again?" Lena asked, surprising herself with how much she hoped the answer would be yes. Alina paused on the threshold, glancing back with an expression that seemed to hold some private amusement. "I think it is very likely," she said, "sooner than you expect." Then she stepped out into the lowering afternoon light and made her way down the narrow street, moving more steadily now, until she turned the corner and was gone from sight. Lena stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the empty street, an odd feeling settling over her that she could not quite explain. There had been something about the old woman, something beyond her obvious dignity and her careful way of speaking, that made Lena certain their paths were not finished crossing. She did not yet know how right she was. Back at the market square, the crowd had long since dispersed, but word of what happened traveled fast through Belmore's narrow streets, as it always did. By the time Lena returned to relieve Nathan at the stall, more than one neighbor had already heard some version of the story, each retelling a little more dramatic than the last. "They're saying you struck her," Nathan said quietly as Lena took her place behind the bread baskets. "Camille Rutherford, I mean, that's the story going around." Lena's stomach tightened. "I never touched her, I only told her to stop." "I know that, but you know how these things go once they leave the mouths that started them." Nathan glanced past her shoulder, his voice dropping further. "Rutherford's man was here not 20 minutes ago, asking which stall belonged to the baker's daughter who caused the trouble." A cold unease settled over Lena, but she forced herself to keep arranging the loaves, not wanting her hands to shake in front of the customers still drifting past. "Let them ask," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "I did nothing wrong. I helped a woman who needed help. If anyone wants to make trouble out of that, they can try." But even as she said it, she could not shake the memory of Camille's parting look, sharp and promising, nor the quiet, knowing way Alina had spoken of people who believed themselves untouchable. Somewhere in Belmore, gears had already begun turning that Lena could not yet see, set into motion by a single act of kindness in a crowded square. She had no way of knowing that the woman she had helped to her feet that afternoon was not simply a traveler resting by a fountain, but the mother of the most powerful man in the entire region, missing from his estate since the previous night, and that within a matter of hours, the full weight of that household would descend upon the quiet street where she lived. For now, she only knew that the sun was setting, the bread needed selling, and somewhere out there, an old woman named Alina was walking alone through streets that were not nearly as safe as she seemed to believe. By the time the last light faded from Belmore's rooftops, Camille Rutherford was already seated across from her father in the study of their tall stone house, recounting the afternoon's events with a version of the truth that bent further from reality with every sentence. "She grabbed my arm and shouted at me in front of half the market," Camille said, pressing a handkerchief to eyes that were not actually crying. "I have never been so humiliated in my life, and all because I asked some old beggar to step out of my path." Edgar Rutherford set down his glass slowly, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. He was a broad man with a heavy brow and cold, calculating eyes, the kind of man who had built his fortune by knowing exactly when to smile and exactly when to strike. "This baker's daughter," he said, "what is her name?" "Lena Doyle. She runs a bread stall near the fountain with her brother." "And people saw this happen?" "The whole square saw it," Camille said, her voice rising with fresh indignation. "She made me look like a fool in front of everyone." Edgar was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass slowly between his fingers. He had not built his standing in Belmore by acting rashly, but he had also not built it by allowing insults to go unanswered, however small they seemed. A merchant's power rested as much on fear as on coin, and every unpunished slight chipped away at both. "I will send word to the constable," he said finally. "A public accusation of assault against a member of this family cannot go unanswered, whatever actually happened in that square. Father, I only want her to understand her place." "She will understand it," Edgar said, and there was something in his tone that made even Camille look away. "By morning, the whole town will know what happens to those who forget it." He rose and crossed to his desk, already reaching for paper and ink, already composing in his mind the letter that would summon Constable Harlan Voss before the night was through. It did not occur to him, and it would not have troubled him even if it had, that the frightened old woman his daughter had shoved into a stack of crates might be connected to anyone of consequence at all. To him, she was simply an inconvenient detail in a story that no longer needed her. Across town, in the Ashcombe estate that rose above the northern hills like a pale stone crown, a very different kind of urgency had taken hold. Duke Julian Ashworth stood in the center of his mother's private chambers, staring at the untouched bed, the folded shawl left across the chair, the small oil lamp still burning low from the night before. His steward, Edmund Price, stood a careful distance away, watching his master's face with the wariness of a man who had served this family long enough to recognize the signs of a temper being held on a very short leash. "She has not been seen since last evening," Edmund said again, though he had already said it twice. Her personal maid assumed she had simply chosen to rest late this morning. It was not until noon that anyone thought to check. "And no one thought to check sooner because my mother has never once in the entirety of her life chosen to rest late," Julian said, his voice dangerously calm. "Something is wrong. She would not simply vanish without a word." "There is no sign of a struggle, my lord. Her traveling cloak is missing, along with a small satchel from the wardrobe. It is possible she left of her own will." Julian turned to face him fully. "My mother has not left these walls unescorted in 15 years, Edmund, not since my father died. Why would she begin now, and why would she do it in secret?" Edmund had no answer for that, and the silence stretched uncomfortably between them until it was broken by the arrival of the head of the household guard, a stern, weathered man named Captain Roswell, who entered with a brief bow and a report that did little to ease the tension in the room. "We have questioned the gate staff, my lord. One of the night guards recalls a cloaked figure passing through the eastern gate shortly before dawn, matching the dowager's height and manner of walking. He assumed she was a servant returning from an errand and did not think to stop her." "Which direction?" Julian asked immediately. "Toward Belmore, my lord." Julian was already moving before the captain finished speaking, striding toward the door with the kind of controlled urgency that made every servant in his path step quickly aside. "Assemble a search party, discreetly. I do not want half the province hearing that the Dowager Duchess has gone missing from her own estate, not until we understand why she left. And if word does spread, my lord—" "Then we will deal with it," Julian said. "But I would rather find my mother before that happens than explain her absence to men who would use it against this family." He did not say aloud what troubled him most, the fear sitting cold and heavy beneath his composure, that his mother had grown so weary of the careful, watched life inside these walls that she had chosen, if only for a single day, to disappear into a world where no one knew her name. It was not an unreasonable fear. He had seen the loneliness behind her eyes at dinners and ceremonies for years, had watched her nod and smile through obligations that clearly exhausted her, and had done too little, he now realized, to ease that particular weight. Within the hour, a dozen riders in plain clothing had been dispatched toward Belmore, instructed to search quietly, to ask careful questions, and above all, to bring the Dowager home before nightfall. Eleanor, meanwhile, had no idea that half a household was already turning itself inside out over her absence. She walked slowly through the streets of Belmore, following the fading light toward the edge of town where a modest inn would allow her to rest before continuing on to meet the carriage she had arranged in secret, the one meant to carry her quietly back to the estate before anyone noticed she had gone. It had seemed, that morning, like such a simple plan. A single day of freedom, of walking among people who did not bow to her, who did not measure every word before speaking it in her presence. She had wanted, just once, to know what it felt like to be treated as an ordinary woman, rather than a title wrapped in silk. She had not expected to be shoved to the ground by a stranger's daughter, nor to be rescued by a baker's daughter with fire in her voice and gentleness in her hands. The encounter had left her shaken, in a way the fall itself had not. It was near the edge of the market district, in a narrow lane between two shuttered shops, that Alina realized she had lost her way. The streets of Belmore twisted more than she remembered from the maps she had studied, and the fading light made every corner look the same as the last. She paused, drawing her shawl tighter, trying to get her bearings, when the sound of footsteps behind her made her go very still. Two men had stepped into the lane, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who knew they were unlikely to be interrupted. One of them, tall and heavy-set, gave a slow smile as he looked her over, taking in the fine weave of her shawl beneath the plain traveling cloak, the kind of detail that marked her as worth more trouble than her simple appearance first suggested. "You're a bit far from anywhere safe, aren't you?" he said, stepping closer. "Lost, are we?" Alina's heart beat hard against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady, drawing on decades of training that had taught her never to show fear to anyone who might use it against her. "I am simply looking for the road north. I would be grateful for directions, nothing more." "We could show you the way," the second man said, his eyes flicking to the small satchel at her side. "For a price, of course." She took a step back, calculating the distance to the mouth of the lane, the chances of reaching it before either man closed the gap. It was not good, and she knew it, but she had faced worse odds in council chambers and survived through nothing but calm and patience, and she reached now for that same steadiness, even as her pulse raced. "I have very little of value," she said. "You would be wasting your time." The taller man laughed, low and unpleasant. "Let us be the judge of that." He reached for her arm, and Alina twisted away with a speed that surprised even herself, stumbling back against the wall of the lane, her satchel slipping from her shoulder. For one long, terrifying moment, she was certain there was no way out of what was about to happen. Then a voice cut through the narrow street, sharp and commanding, from the direction of the lane's mouth. "Step away from her, now." It was Nathan, Lena's brother, on his way home from the stables with a coil of rope still slung over one shoulder, drawn into the lane by the sound of raised voices. He was not a large man, nor an especially imposing one, but there was something in his stance, feet planted, rope gripped like it might become a weapon if it needed to, that made both men hesitate. "This isn't your business," the taller man said, though his confidence had noticeably thinned. "I'm making it my business," Nathan said. "There's a night watchman 2 streets over, and I intend to shout loud enough that he hears every word of what you're doing here. Or you can walk away right now and save yourselves the trouble." For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then the shorter man muttered something under his breath and tugged at his companion's sleeve, and after one final, calculating look at Nathan, the taller man stepped back, spat on the ground near Alina's feet, and turned away, both of them disappearing quickly into the deepening shadows of the side street. Alina sagged against the wall, her breath coming fast and uneven, and Nathan hurried to her side, steadying her by the elbow with the same easy gentleness his sister had shown that afternoon. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Should I fetch someone?" It took Alina a moment to find her voice. When she looked up at him properly, recognition flickered across her face. "You are Lena's brother," she said, "from the bakery." Nathan blinked in surprise. "You know my sister. She helped me this afternoon in the market square. I am afraid I have had rather more trouble finding my way home than I expected." Alina allowed herself a shaky breath, gathering her composure the way she had been trained to do since childhood, smoothing the fear from her expression even as her hands still trembled faintly at her sides. "I would be very grateful if you could help me find safer streets." "Of course," Nathan said. "Lena would never forgive me if I left you out here alone. Come, I'll walk you wherever you need to go." As they made their way out of the lane and back toward the wider streets, Alina found herself glancing at the darkening sky, thinking of the carriage waiting somewhere beyond the town's edge, of the household surely beginning to worry over her absence, and of the strange, quiet gratitude she felt toward this family of strangers who had, twice now in a single day, stepped between her and harm without knowing, or seeming to care, who she truly was. She did not yet know that riders bearing her son's colors were already moving through the streets of Belmore, asking careful questions at every inn and tavern, drawing steadily closer with every passing hour. Nor did she know that Constable Harlan Voss, summoned by an urgent letter from Edgar Rutherford, was, at that very moment, making his way toward a small stone house near the market square, prepared to question a baker's daughter about an assault that had never actually taken place. The threads of the day were drawing tighter, each one pulling toward the same quiet street, though none of the people walking those threads yet understood how close they were to colliding. Constable Harlan Voss arrived at Lena's door just as she and Nathan were closing the shutters for the night, his lantern casting long shadows across the narrow street. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a practical one, and practical men in Belmore learned early that ignoring the wishes of families like the Rutherfords tended to cost more than it saved. "Lena Doyle?" he asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. "That's me," Lena said, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "Is something wrong, Constable?" "I've had a complaint laid against you. Assault against Camille Rutherford in the market square this afternoon." He said it without much conviction, the way a man recites something he has been told to say rather than something he believes. "I'll need you to come with me to answer for it." Nathan stepped forward immediately, his jaw tight. "That's not what happened. My sister never touched her. She only told her to stop shoving an old woman around." "I understand there are different accounts of the matter," Harlan said carefully. "That's precisely why statements need to be taken properly and not argued about on a doorstep." Lena's stomach twisted, but she kept her voice steady, refusing to let the fear show. "I'm happy to answer any questions, Constable. I have nothing to hide, but I want it noted that I never laid a hand on anyone. I only stepped in to help a woman who had been pushed to the ground." "Noted," Harlan said, though his tone suggested it would matter very little once the matter reached Edgar Rutherford's ears. "Come along, then. It's best we settle this tonight, before it grows into something larger." Lena exchanged a quick glance with Nathan, who looked ready to argue further, but she shook her head slightly, a silent request not to make things worse. She untied her apron, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and followed the constable out into the cooling evening air, her heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit. They had not gone more than 2 streets when the sound of hooves on stone grew loud behind them, a full column of riders moving with purpose through the narrow lanes, their cloaks marked with a crest Lena did not recognize, but which made Constable Voss stiffen immediately at the sight of it. The lead rider called for a halt, and a man dismounted with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed the moment he opened his mouth. He wore no ornate finery, only a plain traveling coat, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, the sharp, searching way his eyes swept the street, that made even Harlan straighten his posture without quite meaning to. "We are searching for a woman," the rider said, his voice cutting cleanly through the evening quiet. "Elderly, traveling alone, likely wearing a gray shawl and dark cloak. She was last seen entering this district earlier today. Has anyone in this street encountered her?" Lena's breath caught. She thought immediately of Alina, of the careful, watchful way she had spoken, of the quiet certainty in her final words at the doorway. "I think it is very likely, sooner than you expect." "I know her," Lena said before she had fully decided to speak. "Or I met her at least, this afternoon in the market square. She was injured and I brought her to my home to tend to her." Every eye in the street turned toward her. The lead rider crossed the distance between them in a few quick strides, his expression sharpening with an urgency that bordered on desperation, though he controlled it well. "Where is she now?" "She left my home before sundown, saying she needed to continue on her way. I don't know exactly where she intended to go." Lena hesitated, then added because it felt important, because something in this man's face told her it mattered greatly. "My brother walked with her partway after some trouble in one of the back lanes. He should be back soon. He may know more than I do." As if summoned by the words themselves, Nathan came hurrying around the corner at that very moment, having followed at a careful distance once he realized the constable's business might not end cleanly. He stopped short at the sight of the mounted riders filling the street, his eyes going wide. "Nathan," Lena called, "where did you leave Alina?" "At the crossroads near the old chapel," Nathan said, catching his breath. "There was a carriage waiting for her there, plain, no markings. She said someone was expecting her. I made certain she reached it safely before I turned back." The lead rider's expression shifted, relief and renewed urgency mingling together. "The old chapel crossroads, how long ago?" "Perhaps a quarter hour." The rider turned immediately, already calling orders to the men behind him, several breaking away toward the chapel road at a hard gallop while others remained, watching the street with sharp, careful attention. "You said trouble," the rider said, turning back to Nathan. "What kind of trouble?" "Two men in one of the lanes near the shuttered shops. They meant her harm, I'm certain of it." "I only happened to be passing." The rider's jaw tightened, and for a moment something dangerous flickered behind his controlled expression, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You have my gratitude, both of you, more than you know." He glanced at Constable Voss, who had gone very quiet and very still throughout the exchange, clearly recalculating whatever plans he had walked into this street with. "And you, Constable, what business did you have with this young woman tonight?" Harlan cleared his throat, suddenly far less certain of himself than he had been minutes earlier. "A complaint of assault, my lord, laid by the Rutherford family." "Against her?" the rider asked, nodding toward Lena. "The same woman who spent her afternoon tending to a stranger's injuries, and her evening providing information that may well save that same woman's life." "The complaint was laid before I understood the full circumstances," Harlan said carefully. "Then I would suggest you understand them fully before proceeding any further," the rider said, his voice cool and precise. "I do not yet know the details of what happened in that market square today, but I intend to learn them thoroughly and from every party involved. Until then, this young woman will not be marched through the streets on the word of a merchant's daughter." Lena stood frozen through the entire exchange, trying to piece together what was happening, who this commanding stranger was, and why the fate of an old woman she had known for a single afternoon seemed to matter so intensely to armed riders bearing an unfamiliar crest. A cold, creeping suspicion had begun to form in her mind, one she was not yet ready to fully consider. "Forgive me," she said finally, "but who are you? And who is Alina to you that half a company of riders would be searching the streets for her?" The rider studied her for a long moment before answering, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "My name is Julian Ashworth," he said. "Alina is my mother." The words landed in the quiet street like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward before anyone could speak. Lena felt the ground shift beneath her understanding, every small detail of the afternoon rearranging itself into a shape she had not seen coming. The fine cloth beneath the plain shawl, the careful, precise way Alina had spoken, as though every word had been considered before it left her mouth. The quiet dignity that no amount of dust or bruising had managed to diminish. "The Duke," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Yes," Julian said, watching her reaction carefully. "And you are the woman who defended my mother from public humiliation this afternoon, tended her wounds in your own home, and gave her shelter without knowing, or apparently caring, who she was." "I didn't know," Lena said, her voice unsteady now. "I only saw an old woman who had been hurt. It never occurred to me to ask more than that." "I am aware," Julian said, and something in his tone had softened, though only slightly. "That is precisely why it matters." He turned to Constable Voss once more, and this time his voice carried an edge that left no room for argument. "You will inform the Rutherford family that any further complaint against this young woman will be reviewed personally, by me, before any action is taken. I trust that will be sufficient to settle the matter for tonight." Harlan bowed low enough that his lantern nearly touched the ground. "Of course, my lord, entirely sufficient." He retreated quickly, clearly eager to put distance between himself and a situation that had grown far larger than anything he had anticipated when he set out that evening. And within moments he had vanished around the corner, leaving Lena and Nathan standing in the torchlit street with a duke and the remains of his search party. "I must go to the chapel crossroads," Julian said, already turning back toward his horse. "I need to see my mother safely home myself." He paused, glancing back at Lena with an expression she could not quite read, gratitude tangled with something more searching. "But I do not intend to let this matter end here. What you did today, both of you, deserves more than a hurried thanks in the middle of a dark street." "We didn't do it for a reward," Lena said quickly. "We only did what seemed right." "I know," Julian said. "That is exactly why it deserves recognition." He mounted his horse with practiced ease, gathering the reins, then paused once more before giving the signal to ride. "Expect word from Ashcombe within the next few days. My mother will insist on it if nothing else." Then he wheeled his horse and rode hard toward the chapel road, his remaining men falling in behind him, hooves echoing off the stone until the sound faded into the night. Lena stood in the empty street for a long moment, Nathan quiet beside her, both of them trying to absorb the enormity of what had just happened. The old woman she had helped to her feet that afternoon, the one who had sat quietly in her small kitchen drinking tea and speaking of loneliness with such careful honesty, was the mother of the most powerful man in the region. "I can hardly believe it," Nathan said finally. "Neither can I," Lena admitted. She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill, staring down the now empty street toward the chapel road. "I only hope she reaches him safely." At that very moment, farther down that same road, Elinor sat in the plain, unmarked carriage she had arranged that morning, watching through the small window as torchlight appeared in the distance, moving fast toward her. She recognized the pattern of it immediately, the disciplined spacing of riders trained by her son's own captain, and she felt a rush of relief so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Relief not only at being found, but at the knowledge that Julian himself had come looking rather than simply sending men to fetch her home. When the carriage rolled to a stop and the door was pulled open, it was Julian's face that appeared in the frame, illuminated by torchlight, his composure cracking just slightly at the sight of her safe and upright inside. "Mother," he said, and the single word carried more relief and more restrained frustration than any lengthy speech could have managed. "Do you have any idea what this day has cost me in worry alone?" "I am sorry, Julian," Elinor said, and she meant it, though there was no true regret in her eyes for what the day had shown her. "But I needed, just once, to walk among people who did not know my name." "And did you learn what you hoped to learn?" Elinor thought of the market square, of the sharp voice that had cut through the crowd to defend her, of the small stone house with its herb garden and its warm hearth, of the tea shared in comfortable silence with a young woman who asked for nothing in return. "I learned more than I expected," she said softly. "Take me home, Julian. There is a great deal I need to tell you, and a debt I intend for this family to repay properly." Julian climbed into the carriage beside her, signaling for the driver to continue on toward Ashcombe, and as the wheels began to turn once more, he studied his mother's face in the dim lantern light, sensing that whatever had happened to her that day in Belmore had changed something in her, quietly and permanently, in a way he did not yet fully understand. He would understand it soon enough, and so, though she did not yet know it, would Lena Doyle. 3 days passed before the letter arrived, carried not by an ordinary courier, but by a rider in Ashcombe colors, who dismounted in front of the bakery, with a formality that drew the attention of every neighbor on the street. Lena wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the sealed envelope with fingers that were not quite steady, aware of the curious eyes watching from doorways and windows up and down the lane. Inside was an invitation, written in careful, elegant script, requesting the presence of Lena and Nathan Doyle at Ashcombe Estate at their earliest convenience, signed simply, Elinor Ashworth. "They want us to come to the estate," Lena said, reading it a second time as though the words might change. "Both of us." Nathan peered over her shoulder, his eyebrows lifting. "The Dowager Duchess herself is inviting us to her home." "I never imagined I would see the day." "Nor did I," Lena admitted, though beneath the surprise there was something else stirring, a quiet warmth at the thought of seeing Alina again, safe and well, away from the fear and confusion of that first strange afternoon. Word of the invitation spread through Belmore faster than either of them could have anticipated, and by the time they set out the following morning in borrowed traveling clothes, half the market district seemed to know precisely where they were going and why. Among those who knew, none reacted with more discomfort than Edgar Rutherford, who received the news over his morning correspondence with an expression that soured by the moment. "The Duke's mother is receiving them," he said slowly, setting down the letter that had reached him through his own network of informants. "Personally, at the estate." Camille, seated across the breakfast table, looked up sharply. "That can't be right. Why would the Dowager receive some baker's daughter as a guest?" "I do not know," Edgar said, though the careful stillness in his voice suggested he suspected more than he was willing to say aloud. "But I intend to find out before this matter grows any further out of our control." He did not have to wait long. That very afternoon, a second letter arrived at the Rutherford household, this one addressed directly to Edgar, requesting his presence at Ashcombe as well, along with his daughter, to discuss. The letter stated with icy formality, an incident involving members of both households that required proper resolution. Camille went pale reading it over her father's shoulder. "They know," she whispered. "Somehow they know what happened." "Of course they know," Edgar said, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "Whatever else that old woman in the square turned out to be, it seems fairly certain now that she was no beggar at all." Meanwhile, at Ashcombe Estate, Lena and Nathan were led through gates of pale stone and up a long avenue lined with ancient trees, their nerves fraying with every step deeper into a world so far removed from the narrow streets of Belmore that it hardly seemed to belong to the same country. Servants in neat livery moved silently through the halls, and portraits of stern, unfamiliar ancestors watched from every wall as they were guided toward a private receiving room. Alina was waiting for them there, seated near a tall window with sunlight spilling across the polished floor, and the moment she saw them enter, her composed, dignified expression broke into a warm, genuine smile that erased, for a moment, every trace of formality in the room. "Lena," she said, rising to greet them both, "and Nathan, I am so pleased you accepted my invitation." "We could hardly refuse, Your Grace," Lena said, attempting an awkward curtsy that made Alina laugh softly and wave the gesture away. "Please, none of that between us. You did not treat me as a duchess when it mattered most, and I have no wish for you to begin now." Alina gestured toward the chairs arranged near her own, inviting them to sit, and for a moment the strangeness of the surroundings faded into something closer to the comfortable warmth of that first afternoon in Lena's small kitchen. "I owe you both a great deal more than words can properly express, but I intend to try regardless." "You don't owe us anything," Lena said. "We only did what anyone should have done." "That is precisely the trouble with your generation of thinking," Alina said, not unkindly. "You believe kindness that costs you something is simply ordinary. I promise you it is not. I have lived within these walls my entire adult life, surrounded by people whose kindness was carefully measured against what they hoped to gain from it. What you offered me asked for nothing in return. That is a rarer gift than you seem to understand." Before Lena could formulate a response to that, the doors opened once more and Julian entered, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere of the room, though not unpleasantly. He greeted Lena and Nathan with a respectful nod that seemed, to Lena's surprise, entirely without the careless superiority she had expected from a man of his standing. "I trust the journey here was comfortable," he said. "Very much so, my lord," Nathan answered, still visibly overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding them. "Good." Julian's gaze moved to Lena, lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary before he continued. "There is a further matter to attend to this afternoon, one I believe both of you should witness, given your part in how it began. The Rutherford family has been summoned to answer for the incident in the market square." Lena's stomach tightened at the mention of the name. "Is that necessary? I have no wish to cause further trouble." You caused none of this trouble, Eleanor said firmly. You merely refused to let it go unanswered. There is a difference, and it is one Edgar Rutherford and his daughter would do well to learn. An hour later, the receiving hall had been arranged for a far more formal gathering, and Lena found herself standing near Eleanor's chair, as Edgar and Camille Rutherford were shown into the room, both of them visibly uneasy beneath their carefully composed expressions. Camille's eyes widened the moment she recognized the elderly woman seated at the head of the room, the color draining rapidly from her face as understanding dawned in full. "Your Grace," Edgar said, bowing low, his voice carefully controlled despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "We came as soon as your invitation reached us." "I am glad you did," Eleanor said, her tone pleasant but unmistakably firm. "There is a matter that requires clarity, and I find it is best addressed directly, rather than allowed to fester through rumor and complaint." She recounted, with precise and unhurried detail, the events of that afternoon in the market square, describing without exaggeration the moment she had been shoved to the ground, injured, and left struggling to rise while a crowd looked on and did nothing, until a single stranger stepped forward to help her. "That stranger," Eleanor continued, "was Lena Doyle, who did not know who I was, who asked for no reward, and who has since faced accusations of assault laid against her by the very family responsible for the harm I suffered that day." Camille's composure finally broke entirely. "Your Grace, I did not know who you were." "I never intended." "Whether you knew who I was is entirely irrelevant to the matter," Eleanor said, cutting her off with a calm that was somehow more cutting than any raised voice could have managed. "You laid hands on an elderly stranger in a public square because she was, in your judgment, beneath your notice. That is the truth of what happened, regardless of my identity, and it is a truth that speaks a great deal about your character, Miss Rutherford." Camille had no response to that. She stood in silence, her earlier confidence entirely gone, while beside her, Edgar's jaw tightened with the particular fury of a man watching his family standing crumble in real time. "I did not summon you here for an apology, though I expect one before you leave," Eleanor continued. "I summoned you here so that the truth of this matter would be understood clearly, by everyone involved, and so that the complaint laid against Lena Doyle would be formally withdrawn, in writing, before witnesses." "Of course, Your Grace," Edgar said quickly, already reaching for the pen and paper a servant had discreetly provided. "The complaint will be withdrawn immediately. I assure you this family had no wish to cause offense to your household." "You had no wish to be caught causing offense," Eleanor said. "There is a meaningful difference, Edgar, and I suspect you know it well." He said nothing to that, focusing instead on completing the formal withdrawal with as much haste as dignity would allow, while Camille stood pale and silent beside him, her earlier confidence entirely dismantled. When the paper was signed and witnessed, Julian stepped forward, his voice carrying the same quiet authority his mother had wielded throughout the exchange. "I trust this matter is now fully resolved, and that no further complaints, formal or otherwise, will find their way toward the Doyle family from this household." "None, my lord," Edgar said. "You have my word." "See that it remains so," Julian said, and something in his tone made it clear the warning was not one to be tested twice. The Rutherfords were shown out shortly after, Camille's earlier bravado replaced by a chastened silence that seemed, for the first time, to carry genuine understanding rather than mere fear of consequence. Lena watched them go with a strange mixture of relief and discomfort, unused to being at the center of such a public reckoning. "You did not have to do all of that on our account," she said quietly, once the room had emptied. "I did not do it only for your account," Eleanor said, turning to face her with an expression of quiet warmth. "I did it because it was right, and because I find, increasingly, that I no longer wish to remain silent simply for the sake of comfort." She reached out and took Lena's hand between both of hers, her grip surprisingly firm despite her earlier frailty. "You gave me back something today, Lena, though you did not know it at the time. You reminded me what it feels like to be helped without condition. I do not intend to let that lesson go to waste." Lena felt an unexpected tightness in her throat, surprised by how deeply the words affected her. "I'm glad I could help," she said simply, "in whatever small way I did." "It was not small," Julian said quietly from where he stood nearby, and when Lena glanced toward him, she found his eyes fixed on her with an expression far more thoughtful than she had expected, one that made her look away first, her cheeks warming slightly despite herself. Whatever this day had begun, in the market square 3 days earlier, Lena had the distinct sense that it was far from finished. And she was right, though she could not yet have guessed how much further the story still had to unfold, nor the dangers that still waited quietly in the shadows behind Edgar Rutherford's carefully composed retreat. The public humiliation at Ashcombe left a wound in Edgar Rutherford that no formal apology could heal. He rode home in silence, Camille beside him equally quiet, and it was not until the doors of their own house closed behind them that his composure finally cracked. 15 years, he said, his voice low and dangerous. 15 years building this family's name in that town, and in a single afternoon, a baker's daughter and her brother have made us the subject of every whisper from the market square to the harbor district. "Father, I'm sorry." "Sorry does nothing," Edgar snapped, then caught himself, smoothing his expression back into something more controlled. "No, this is not finished. The Duke may believe the matter is closed because a paper was signed and witnessed, but reputations are not repaired by paperwork. They are repaired by results." "What do you mean to do?" Edgar did not answer immediately. He moved to his study window, looking out over the rooftops of Belmore, his mind already turning through the quiet, careful calculations that had built his fortune over decades. He did not intend to move against the Doyles directly, not so soon after the Duke's warning, but there were other ways to apply pressure, ways that left no fingerprints and no formal complaints to be withdrawn. "The bakery relies on flour from the northern mills," he said finally. "Flour that passes, at some point in its journey, through warehouses that either belong to this family or owe this family a great many favors." Camille's eyes widened with understanding. "You mean to cut off their supply?" "I mean to remind this town who controls the flow of goods through it," Edgar said. "Nothing more. If a certain bakery finds its usual suppliers suddenly unwilling to extend credit or unable to guarantee delivery, that is simply the nature of business. No one can accuse this family of wrongdoing over the ordinary difficulties of trade." It began quietly, exactly as Edgar intended. Within a week, the mill that had supplied Lena's bakery for the past 3 years sent word that they could no longer extend the usual terms of credit, citing vague difficulties with their own suppliers. When Lena sought an alternative source, she found doors closing with strange consistency, merchants suddenly too busy, too uncertain, too cautious to commit to new arrangements. "It's them," Nathan said one evening, pacing the small kitchen while Lena stared at the dwindling flour stores lining their shelves. "It has to be. Every miller in the district owes something to the Rutherfords, one way or another." "I know," Lena said quietly. "But I have no proof of it, and even if I did, what could we do? Edgar Rutherford has never touched us directly. He's only made certain that everyone around us grows too nervous to help. Then we'll find flour from farther out, the Southern Valley mills perhaps. At twice the price, with the added cost of transport eating whatever profit remains," Lena said, rubbing her temples. "We'd be selling bread at a loss within the month." It was a slow, methodical kind of harm, precisely the sort Edgar had designed it to be, difficult to name, impossible to formally complain about, and devastating all the same to a small business that ran on thin margins and steady supply. Within 2 weeks, Lena had been forced to reduce the bakery's offerings, and within 3, she had begun quietly wondering whether they would need to close the stall altogether until better arrangements could be found. She did not intend to trouble Eleanor or Julian with the difficulty. It felt, somehow, like an admission of weakness, an implication that their earlier kindness had come with strings attached, and Lena's pride would not allow that. But word travels quickly in a town as small as Belmore, and it was not long before it reached ears she had not expected. Edmund Price, the steward at Ashcombe, had maintained a quiet habit since the incident in the market square of keeping informal watch over how the town's merchants treated the Doyle family. A task Julian had never explicitly assigned, but had also never discouraged. When word reached him of the mysterious troubles suddenly plaguing a certain bakery near the fountain, he recognized the pattern immediately for what it was, and brought the matter directly to Julian without delay. "It is subtle," Edmund explained, standing before the Duke's desk with a folder of quiet inquiries he had gathered over the past several days. No formal complaint, no direct confrontation. Simply a series of suppliers, suddenly unwilling to extend the usual terms, spreading across every mill and merchant with ties to the Rutherford family. Julian's expression darkened as he listened. He gave his word. He gave his word not to pursue the matter through formal complaint, my lord. This is not that. This is something far harder to prove and far more difficult to answer through official channels. Julian rose from his desk, pacing the length of his study with barely restrained frustration. He had known, in some quiet corner of his mind, that a man like Edgar Rutherford would not simply accept public humiliation and retreat without seeking some form of quiet retaliation. He had underestimated, perhaps, how quickly and how cleverly that retaliation would come. "Prepare my horse," he said finally. "I intend to see this bakery for myself." He arrived in Belmore within the hour, dressed plainly enough to avoid drawing immediate attention, though word of his presence spread through the market district almost as fast as if he had arrived in full ceremonial dress. Lena was arranging the last of a thin supply of loaves when she looked up to find him standing at the edge of her stall, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with quiet concern. "My lord," she said, startled, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor did I expect to find your shelves quite so bare," Julian said, glancing at the noticeably reduced display before her. "Edmund tells me you have been having difficulty with your suppliers." Lena's cheeks colored slightly, caught between embarrassment and a stubborn reluctance to admit weakness. "It's a temporary matter. Every business has difficult seasons." "This began the same week Edgar Rutherford signed a formal withdrawal of his complaint against you," Julian said, his voice quiet but firm. "I do not believe in coincidence of that particular kind, and I suspect, if I am honest, that you do not either." Lena hesitated, then let out a slow breath, the careful composure she had maintained for weeks finally cracking under the weight of his direct attention. "I have no proof," she admitted. "Every door that's closed has closed politely, with reasonable excuses. There's nothing I could point to and call unfair." "That is precisely how a man like Edgar Rutherford prefers to operate," Julian said, quietly enough that no one can name the wrongdoing, while thoroughly enough that the damage is undeniable regardless. He studied her for a long moment, something resolute settling into his expression. "You should have sent word to Ashcombe the moment this began." "I didn't want it to seem as though I expected favors in exchange for what happened in the market square," Lena said. "That was never why I helped your mother." "I know that," Julian said, and something in his voice softened slightly. "I have never once believed otherwise. But there is a difference between accepting undeserved favors and accepting protection from harm that was inflicted specifically because of the kindness you showed. This is not charity, Lena. This is simply justice, delayed by your own stubborn pride." Despite herself, Lena felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "My brother tells me the same thing rather often." "Then your brother is a sensible man." Julian glanced around the modest stall once more, his mind already working through the practical matter at hand. "Ashcombe maintains its own agreements with several mills across the province, arrangements entirely separate from anything the Rutherford family controls. I intend to see that your bakery is included among those arrangements, effective immediately." "My lord, I couldn't possibly." "You can, and you will," Julian said, though not unkindly. "This is not a favor granted out of pity, Lena. It is a correction of an injustice that should never have been allowed to happen in the first place. I would extend the same protection to any merchant in Belmore suffering under the same quiet cruelty, and I intend to look far more closely into how widespread that cruelty has become." Lena studied his face, searching for any trace of the careless superiority she had half expected from a man of his position, and found none. There was only quiet, resolute determination, the same kind she had seen in Aliner's eyes during the confrontation with the Rutherfords, a family trait, it seemed, of refusing to let injustice pass simply because confronting it proved inconvenient. "Thank you," she said finally, the words feeling inadequate against the weight of what he was offering. "Truly." "There is no need to thank me for doing what is right," Julian said. Then, after a brief pause, something almost hesitant crossing his usually composed features, he added, "Though I confess, I find myself looking for excuses to ride into Belmore rather more often than estate business strictly requires." Lena felt her cheeks warm again, uncertain how to respond to the quiet admission, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the noise of the market swirling around them while something unspoken settled comfortably into the space between their words. The arrangement with Ashcombe's mills was finalized within days, and Lena's shelves filled once more with fresh bread, her worries over the bakery's survival easing for the first time in weeks. But word of Julian's intervention reached Edgar Rutherford almost as quickly as everything else in Belmore seemed to, and rather than discouraging him, it only sharpened the edge of his resentment into something colder and more calculating. "The Duke involves himself personally now," he said to Camille one evening, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, "over a baker's daughter." "Perhaps it would be wiser to simply let the matter go, father," Camille said carefully, having grown noticeably more cautious since the confrontation at Ashcombe. "We've already suffered enough embarrassment." "Embarrassment I could endure," Edgar said. "What I cannot endure is watching this family standing a road while some fortunate baker's daughter rises in favor with the most powerful house in the province, simply because she happened to be kind to the right stranger on the right afternoon." He turned from the window, something calculating settling into his expression that made Camille distinctly uneasy. "If direct pressure will not work, and quiet pressure has failed as well, then perhaps it is time to consider allies who share our particular grievance against the House of Ashworth." "What allies?" Camille asked warily. Edgar did not answer directly, his mind already turning toward correspondence he had long kept quietly filed away, connections cultivated over years with men whose interests aligned uncomfortably well with his own growing bitterness toward the Duke and his household. "There are those in this province," he said finally, "who have long resented the Ashworth family's hold over trade routes and taxation. Men who would welcome any opportunity to see that hold weakened, and who might prove rather more useful than any mill or merchant I could pressure alone." Camille's unease deepened at the tone of her father's voice, but she said nothing further, sensing that whatever plan was beginning to take shape behind his calculating eyes had already moved beyond anything she could easily talk him out of. Neither Lena nor Julian, absorbed in the quiet relief of one crisis resolved, had any notion of the far larger and more dangerous scheme now beginning to stir in the shadows of Edgar Rutherford's study, one that would soon reach far beyond a single bakery's struggling supply lines, and threat instead the safety of the entire household at Ashcombe. The man Edgar Rutherford summoned to his study 3 nights later was not someone he introduced by name to his own household staff. He arrived after dark, wrapped in a plain traveling cloak much like the one Aliner had worn on the day this entire chain of events began, and he was shown in through the side entrance rather than the main hall. His name was Lord Corwin Haldon, a minor noble from the western border, whose lands had been steadily losing influence to Ashcombe's growing control over the province's trade routes for the better part of a decade. He was a thin, sharp-featured man with the kind of patient, calculating stillness that made Edgar's own ambitions look almost clumsy by comparison. "You said this was a matter of mutual interest," Haldon said, settling into the chair across from Edgar's desk without waiting to be offered a seat. "It is," Edgar said. "The Duke's household has grown too confident in its own untouchability. I have reason to believe that a moment of weakness, properly exploited, could shift a great deal of influence back toward those of us who have watched Ashcombe tighten its grip for too long. And what weakness do you propose? Edgar leaned forward, lowering his voice though there was no one else present to overhear. The Dowager Duchess has developed an unusual attachment to a common family in Belmore, a baker and her brother. The Duke himself has taken a personal interest in protecting them, to the point of intervening directly in matters of trade to shield them from difficulty. Haldon's thin eyebrows lifted slightly. You believe the Duke has grown careless where this family is concerned. I believe he has grown vulnerable, Edgar corrected. A man who allows sentiment to guide his decisions can be maneuvered in ways a purely calculating ruler cannot. If something were to happen to draw both mother and son into a situation requiring a difficult choice, a choice between the safety of this common family and the stability of their own household's reputation, it would reveal precisely how far that sentiment extends, and precisely how it might be used. You are speaking of more than mere pressure now, Haldon said carefully. I am speaking of leverage, Edgar said. Nothing more permanent than that. A brief disruption, carefully managed, that reminds the Duke of Ashcombe exactly how exposed his household remains despite all its wealth and title. Haldon considered this in silence for a long moment, weighing the risk against the considerable reward of seeing Ashcombe's grip on the province finally loosened. I have men who could arrange such a disruption, he said finally. Quietly, and without any trail leading back to either of our names. But I will require assurances that whatever gains result from this arrangement will be shared according to the influence each of us provides. Naturally, Edgar said, already reaching for paper to begin drafting the careful, deniable terms of an alliance. Neither man intended to honor completely once its purpose had been served. Neither of them noticed the young stable hand who had been sent to deliver a late message to Edgar's study, and had paused, uncertain, outside the partially open door, catching enough of the hushed conversation to understand that something dangerous was being planned, though not enough to grasp its full shape. The boy said nothing to anyone in the Rutherford household, fearing the consequences of admitting he had overheard what he should not have, but he mentioned it, hesitantly, to his older cousin 2 days later, a stable hand who happened to work at the Ashcombe estate. By the time the fragmented warning reached Edmund Price, it amounted to little more than rumor, a plot involving the Rutherford family and an unnamed noble, aimed somehow at the baker's family in Belmore. It was not enough to act on with certainty, but it was enough to sharpen Edmund's already careful watch, and enough for him to quietly increase the number of discreet guards observing the streets around Lena's home. It was not enough, in the end, to prevent what happened on a cold, overcast morning nearly a week later. Lena had risen before dawn as always, preparing the morning's bread while Nathan tended to an early errand at the stables, when a knock came at the door, hesitant and unfamiliar. She opened it to find a young woman she did not recognize, breathless and clearly distressed. Please, the woman said, my mother has collapsed near the old chapel road. I don't know what to do and no one else was close enough to help. Lena did not hesitate, the same instinct that had driven her into the market square weeks earlier already pulling her toward the door. Show me, she said, grabbing her shawl. It was only once they had left the familiar streets of Belmore behind, moving down the quieter chapel road where Lena's carriage had once waited, that the wrongness of the situation began to prickle at the edges of Lena's awareness. The woman's urgency had faded into something colder, more purposeful, and when Lena slowed her steps, glancing around at the empty road with growing unease, she found her arms suddenly seized in a grip far stronger than the frightened daughter she had believed she was helping. I'm sorry, the woman said, though her voice held no genuine apology in it. But you're worth rather more to certain people than the story I told you. Lena's heart slammed against her ribs as 2 more figures emerged from behind the low chapel wall, moving with the calm efficiency of men who had done this sort of work before. She opened her mouth to scream, and a firm hand clamped over it before the sound could carry, muffling her cry as she was pulled roughly toward a waiting cart hidden just off the road. She fought, twisting and kicking with every ounce of strength she possessed, but the grip on her was too strong, too practiced, and within moments she found herself bound and lifted into the back of the cart, the world narrowing to fear and the rough wooden boards beneath her as the cart lurched into motion. It was Nathan who first realized something was terribly wrong, returning from the stables to find the bakery unattended, the morning's bread half prepared and abandoned on the counter, the front door standing open to the cold. His stomach dropped immediately, old instinct born of years of protecting his sister flaring into sharp, immediate panic. He ran first to the neighbors, then to the market square, questioning anyone who might have seen her leave, and it was an elderly fruit seller near the fountain who finally provided the thread he needed, recalling a young woman he did not know leading Lena hurriedly down the chapel road not long after sunrise. Nathan did not waste time deliberating. He ran the entire distance to Ashcombe, arriving breathless and pale at the gates, demanding entry with such desperate urgency that the guards, recognizing him from the earlier events involving the Dowager, brought him immediately to Edmund Price rather than turning him away. "My sister is gone," Nathan gasped out, barely able to catch his breath. "Taken, I'm certain of it. There was a woman claiming her mother had collapsed near the chapel road, and now Lena is nowhere to be found." Edmund's expression turned grave immediately, the fragmented rumor he had received days earlier suddenly crystallizing into something far more urgent and real. "The chapel road," he repeated. "Show me exactly where." Word reached Julian within minutes, and whatever composure he had carefully maintained throughout the earlier difficulties with the Rutherford family shattered entirely at the news. He was on horseback before Edmund had finished relaying the full account, a dozen riders scrambling to follow him as he thundered out through the estate gates toward Belmore. "If Rutherford is behind this," Julian said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury as Edmund rode beside him, "he has made an error far graver than he understands. We do not yet know for certain that it is him, my lord." "I know enough," Julian said. "The timing, the target, the method of it. This bears every mark of a man, attempting to strike at what he believes is my weakness." They reached the chapel road within the hour, and it was Nathan, riding double behind one of the guards, who spotted the faint impression of cart wheels veering off the main path into a stretch of thin woodland that led, eventually, toward an abandoned mill near the province's western edge, a stretch of land that fell, Edmund noted grimly, well within territory historically claimed by the Haldon family. "Haldon," Julian said, the name landing like confirmation of everything he had feared. Rutherford did not act alone in this. They rode hard through the thinning woodland, Julian's fear for Lena's safety sharpening every sense into painful clarity, until the old mill came into view ahead, its broken water wheel still and silent against the gray morning sky. There was a single cart tethered near the entrance, and the faint sound of voices drifting from within. Julian raised a hand, signaling his riders to slow and dismount quietly at the edge of the tree line, unwilling to risk a reckless charge that might endanger Lena further. "We move carefully," he said, his voice low. "I want her safe above all else. Whatever consequence, Rutherford and Haldon are owed can wait until she is." Inside the mill, Lena sat bound to a wooden post near the center of the dust-filled room, her wrists raw from the rope, her mind racing through every possibility of escape, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her careful thinking. The two men who had taken her spoke quietly near the entrance, their voices too low for her to make out clearly, but she caught enough fragments, a message to be sent, a demand to be made, to understand that she had become exactly what Edgar Rutherford had intended all along, a piece to be used against the household that had shown her such unexpected kindness. She refused to let the fear paralyze her entirely. She worked quietly at the rope binding her wrists, testing its give, searching for any weakness in the knot that her captors in their haste might have overlooked. It was the sudden, sharp cry of alarm from outside the mill that told her something had shifted. She heard raised voices, the scrape of blades being drawn, the heavy thud of boots against packed earth, and then, cutting through it all, a voice she recognized immediately, commanding and unmistakably urgent. "Lena." "In here," she called back, her voice cracking with relief. "I'm in here." The mill door burst open moments later, and Julian appeared in the frame, his expression shifting from fierce, controlled fury to raw relief the instant his eyes found her, bound but unharmed, near the center of the room. He crossed the distance in a few quick strides, kneeling to work at the ropes with hands that were, for the first time since she had known him, visibly unsteady. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with barely restrained emotion. "No," Lena said, though her own hands trembled as the ropes finally loosened. "Frightened but not hurt." Outside, the sound of the brief scuffle had already faded, Julian's guards having overwhelmed her captors with the same swift, disciplined efficiency they had shown weeks earlier in the streets of Belmore. Edmund's voice carried in from beyond the door, reporting that both men had been secured, along with enough correspondence found in their possession to confirm exactly whose orders had sent them. Julian helped Lena to her feet, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of how close the morning had come to ending in genuine tragedy settling heavily between them. Then, unable to help herself, Lena let out a shaky breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, the fear of the past hour finally beginning to release its grip. "I seem to have made rather a habit of needing rescue lately," she said. "I seem to have made rather a habit of arriving just in time to provide it," Julian said, the ghost of a relieved smile tugging at his mouth despite everything. "Though I would very much prefer, from this point forward, that neither of us continue the pattern." "I would prefer that as well," Lena admitted. He guided her carefully out of the mill and into the pale morning light, where Nathan was waiting, having ridden the final distance despite Edmund's insistence that he remain behind for safety. He pulled Lena into a fierce embrace the moment she was within reach, his relief too great for words. Behind them, Julian's guards were already preparing to escort the two captured men back toward Ashcombe, along with the damning correspondence that would soon make it impossible for either Edgar Rutherford or Lord Halden to claim innocence in what had very nearly become an unforgivable tragedy. The morning had begun in fear, but it was ending, Lena realized as she leaned gratefully into her brother's embrace, with the truth finally close enough to reach. The correspondence found on the two captured men proved more damning than even Julian had expected. Among the folded papers was a letter in Edgar Rutherford's own hand, careful in its wording, but unmistakable in its meaning, once read, alongside the confessions the two men gave in exchange for leniency, admitting they had been hired through an intermediary connected to Lord Halden's household, with instructions to take Lena and hold her until further word arrived on how she might be used. Word of the failed conspiracy reached the provincial magistrate within a day, and what followed was neither swift nor especially dramatic, but it was thorough. Julian insisted on proper process rather than private vengeance, though it cost him considerable restraint to do so, and within a fortnight both Edgar Rutherford and Lord Corwin Halden found themselves summoned before a formal tribunal convened at the provincial seat, their carefully built reputations unraveling before an audience that included merchants, nobles, and common folk alike, all drawn by the scandal that had, by then, become the talk of every tavern and market stall from Belmore to the western border. Edgar attempted, at first, to deny any knowledge of the plot, insisting the letter had been forged or misinterpreted, but the testimony of the captured men, combined with the account given by the young stable hand who had overheard the original conversation between Edgar and Halden, left little room for doubt. Camille, called to testify regarding her father's state of mind in the weeks following the incident in the market square, could not bring herself to lie outright under the weight of the tribunal's questioning, and her hesitant, halting testimony did more damage to her father's defense than any single piece of evidence. "He spoke of leverage," she admitted quietly, unable to meet her father's furious glare from across the chamber. "He said the Duke had grown vulnerable. I did not know, truly, what that would come to mean. I swear I did not know he intended harm to come to anyone." Whether or not that was entirely true, it did little to shield Edgar from the consequences of what his ambition had ultimately produced. The tribunal stripped him of his trading licenses across the province, a punishment that struck at the very foundation of the wealth and influence he had spent decades building, and barred him from holding any formal position of civic authority for the remainder of his life. Lord Halden fared little better, losing what remained of his already diminished standing among the province's nobility, his lands placed under closer oversight by the Crown's Regional Council to prevent any further scheming against neighboring households. Camille was spared formal punishment, given her cooperation and the tribunal's judgment that she had been more a follower of her father's ambitions than an architect of them, but the social cost proved steep regardless. The Rutherford name, once spoken with a kind of wary respect throughout Belmore, became instead a cautionary tale, whispered in market stalls as an example of what unchecked pride and cruelty could ultimately cost. Lena attended none of the tribunal proceedings herself, having no wish to relive the fear of that morning at the mill in front of a watching crowd. But she received careful, detailed reports from Nathan, who insisted on witnessing every session, driven by a fierce need to see the matter through to its proper end. "It's over," he told her, returning home on the final evening of the tribunal, exhaustion and relief mingling clearly on his face. "Truly over. Rutherford has lost nearly everything, and Halden along with him." Lena absorbed the news quietly, sitting near the hearth of their small home, the same hearth where she had first tended Aliner's wounds so many weeks earlier. "I take no pleasure in it," she said finally. "Not truly, but I am glad it's finished." "You're allowed to take some pleasure in it," Nathan said gently, settling beside her. "After everything they put you through." "Perhaps," Lena admitted. "But mostly, I am simply glad to be able to sleep without fear of a knock at the door." A few days later, a formal summons arrived from Ashcombe once more, though this one carried none of the anxious formality of the first invitation weeks earlier. Instead, it requested Lena and Nathan's presence at a public gathering to be held in the great hall of the estate, an occasion, the letter explained, meant to properly honor the courage and integrity shown throughout the recent difficulties, before an audience of the province's most respected households. Lena felt a flush of discomfort at the idea of such public attention, but Alina, when Lena voiced her hesitation during a quiet visit to the estate the following week, would hear none of her objections. "You saved yourself a great deal of harm through your own quick thinking that morning at the mill," Alina said, "and you showed this family a kindness weeks before that which asked for nothing in return. It is right that both should be properly acknowledged, not hidden away out of some misplaced modesty." "I don't need acknowledgement," Lena said. "I only wanted the trouble to end." "I know," Alina said, taking her hand with the same warmth she had shown from their very first meeting. "That is precisely why you deserve it." The gathering, when it arrived, filled Ashcombe's great hall with more finely dressed guests than Lena had ever imagined standing among. Nobles and merchants from across the province drawn by curiosity as much as genuine respect, all eager to witness the conclusion of a scandal that had dominated conversation for weeks. Lena stood near the front of the hall in a modest but well-made dress, gifted quietly by Alina for the occasion, Nathan at her side looking equally uncertain in unfamiliar formal clothing. Julian addressed the gathered crowd from a raised dais near the head of the hall, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber as he recounted, with careful honesty, the events that had unfolded over the past 2 months, beginning with a simple act of kindness in a crowded market square, and ending with a conspiracy that had threatened the safety of an innocent young woman. "There are those in this province," Julian said, his gaze sweeping deliberately across the assembled crowd, "who believe that power exists to be wielded without consequence, that wealth and title excuse cruelty toward those who possess neither. The events of these past weeks have proven, I hope, that such thinking carries a cost, and that this household will not stand quietly by while it goes unanswered." He turned then to where Lena and Nathan stood, and something in his expression softened noticeably, the formal authority of his address giving way to something more personal. Lena Doyle showed my mother a kindness she owed no obligation to show, protected her without knowing who she truly was, and endured hardship, threat, and genuine danger as a direct consequence of that kindness. Her brother, Nathan, showed the same courage in his own right, protecting my mother from harm in a darkened street before any of us understood the full weight of what was happening. This family owes them both a debt that cannot be fully repaid through ceremony alone, but we intend to honor it as fully as we are able." He gestured, and a servant stepped forward bearing a small, ornate box, which Julian opened to reveal a deed, carefully sealed and ribboned, granting the Doyle family formal ownership of the very bakery stall they had operated for years under lease, along with additional property adjoining it, freeing them permanently from the kind of quiet economic pressure that had nearly destroyed their livelihood weeks earlier. "This is not charity," Julian said, echoing words he had spoken to Lena once before, "but correction and recognition long overdue." Lena accepted the deed with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the weight of the gesture and the eyes of the entire hall upon her. She managed a quiet, sincere word of thanks, though she found herself unable to form anything more elaborate under the circumstances, and it was Alina, stepping forward from beside her son, who finally spoke the words that settled the moment into something Lena would carry with her for the rest of her life. "I have lived a long time within these walls," Alina said, addressing the crowd with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every ounce of respect she commanded, surrounded by people who measured their kindness against what they hoped to gain from it. "Lena Doyle asked for nothing when she helped me, and she has been made to suffer greatly for that kindness in the weeks since. Let it be known throughout this province that such kindness, wherever it is found, will be recognized and protected by this household, regardless of birth or standing." The hall erupted into applause, and Lena stood at the center of it, overwhelmed and grateful, and still, somehow, entirely herself, a baker's daughter from a narrow street in Belmore who had simply refused to look away when someone needed help. It was, in every meaningful sense, an ending, but as Lena would come to understand in the months that followed, it was also, quietly and unexpectedly, a beginning. Autumn settled over Belmore in the weeks that followed, painting the market square in shades of amber and gold, and life, for the first time in months, began to feel steady again. The bakery, now fully the Doyle family's own, thrived under the security of its new arrangements, and Lena found herself, more often than not, smiling as she worked, free from the quiet dread that had shadowed her days since the confrontation with Camille Rutherford so many weeks earlier. Nathan had taken to the added responsibility of managing the expanded property with quiet pride, overseeing the small adjoining space Julian had granted them, and slowly transforming it into a proper shopfront rather than a simple market stall. He spoke often in those early weeks of how strange it still felt to walk past their small stone house, and know, with certainty, that no letter from a merchant demanding payment or a constable bearing false accusations would arrive to disturb their peace again. "It still doesn't feel entirely real," he admitted one evening, sweeping flour from the new shop's freshly laid floor. "All of it. Sometimes I expect to wake and find it was simply a very long, very strange dream." "I understand," Lena said, though in truth, the changes had settled into her own life far more gently than she might have expected, woven quietly into the rhythm of ordinary days until they no longer felt extraordinary at all. What did still feel extraordinary, in a way she had not yet found the words to fully name, was the growing frequency of Julian's visits to Belmore. What had begun as formal, necessary meetings regarding the bakery's new arrangements had, over the weeks, softened into something far less formal and far more difficult to explain away as mere obligation. He arrived, more often than not, without any particular business reason at all, finding excuses that grew thinner and more transparent with each visit, until neither of them bothered pretending the excuses were entirely necessary. "I've come to inspect the new shopfront," he announced one crisp afternoon in early autumn, though the shopfront had been finished and inspected twice already in the preceding weeks. "Have you?" Lena said, not bothering to hide her amusement as she wiped flour from her hands. "And does it meet your approval, my lord?" Entirely, Julian said, glancing around the small space with an expression that suggested he had barely looked at it at all. Though I confess the inspection was somewhat secondary to my actual reason for coming. And what reason is that? He hesitated, an uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing his features, the same composed authority that had commanded riders and tribunals alike faltering slightly beneath the weight of a far simpler question. I find that I have grown rather fond of the walk from Ashcombe to Belmore, he said finally, and rather fonder still of the company waiting at the end of it. Lena felt warmth rise in her cheeks, though she did not look away. That's a rather roundabout way of saying something simpler, isn't it? Perhaps, Julian admitted, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. I have spent a great deal of my life choosing words carefully, weighing every sentence before it left my mouth. It seems I have not entirely lost the habit, even when a simpler truth would serve far better. And what is the simpler truth? He met her eyes fully then, any remaining hesitation falling away. That I think of you far more often than a duke ought to think of a baker's daughter he has known for only a handful of months. That I find myself measuring the value of my days by whether they include the chance to see you. And that I have grown weary of pretending these visits are about shop fronts and trade arrangements when we both know perfectly well they are not. Lena set down the cloth in her hands, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. I've wondered, she said quietly, whether I was imagining the way you look at me sometimes. You were not imagining it, Julian said. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the small shop quiet around them, autumn light slanting warm through the window. Then Lena laughed softly, shaking her head at the strangeness of it all, a duke standing in her family's modest bakery, speaking of fondness and weariness of pretense as though the difference between their stations had simply ceased to matter. My mother would find this entire situation rather remarkable, Julian said, watching her laugh with an expression of quiet, undisguised affection. Though I suspect she would also claim to have known it was coming long before either of us admitted it aloud. She does have a habit of knowing things before anyone else notices them, Lena said, thinking of Aliner's knowing smile the very first time Lena had asked if they would meet again. I think it is very likely, sooner than you expect. She told me that, you know, on the very first day we met, before either of us understood who the other truly was. That sounds precisely like her, Julian said, laughing softly. She has always possessed a talent for seeing things clearly long before the rest of us catch up. Aliner, when informed some weeks later of the quiet understanding that had grown between her son and the young woman who had once tended her injuries in a small stone kitchen, received the news with an expression of such deep, unguarded satisfaction that Julian found himself briefly, uncharacteristically embarrassed by his mother's obvious delight. I told you, Aliner said simply, settling into her favorite chair near the window of her private chambers, that the kindness she showed me was rarer than most people understand. I did not imagine, that first afternoon, that it would grow into something quite so significant for this family. But I cannot say I am entirely surprised. You make it sound as though you arranged the entire affair yourself, Julian said, a wry note in his voice. I arranged nothing, Aliner said, though the twinkle in her eye suggested she took a certain quiet pride in having, at the very least, recognized the possibility before either of them had. I only walked into a market square in disguise and allowed fate to do the rest. The following spring, Belmore found itself host to a celebration unlike anything the town had witnessed in living memory, as the wedding of Duke Julian Ashworth to Lena Doyle drew guests from across the province, filling the market square and surrounding streets with color and music that lasted long into the evening. It was, by careful and deliberate choice, held not within the formal grandeur of Ashcombe's great hall, but in Belmore itself, near the very fountain where Lena had first stepped between Aliner and harm, a decision that Aliner herself had quietly suggested and Julian had embraced without hesitation. It seems fitting, Aliner said, standing beside Nathan as they watched the ceremony unfold beneath a canopy of early spring blossoms, That a story which began in that square should find its truest celebration there as well. Nathan, who had grown considerably more comfortable in Aliner's company over the preceding months, nodded in quiet agreement, his eyes bright with the particular happiness reserved for watching someone you love find joy they had never dared to expect. "She never imagined this," he said softly. "Not in her wildest thoughts, growing up in that little stone house. She only ever wanted enough flour to keep the ovens running and enough coin to keep us fed. And now she has considerably more than that," Aliner said, smiling as Lena and Julian exchanged their final vows before the gathered crowd. "Though I suspect, if you asked her, she would tell you that none of it matters half so much as simply having found someone who values her exactly as she is." The celebration stretched long into the evening, laughter and music filling the streets that had once carried whispers of scandal and fear, transforming them instead into a place of genuine joy. Camille Rutherford, present at the edges of the gathering in a far more modest capacity than the standing her family had once enjoyed, watched the celebration with an expression that held no bitterness, only a quiet, chastened understanding of how far her own choices had once strayed from the kind of decency now being celebrated so openly before her. She had spent the months since the tribunal working to rebuild something honest from the ruins of her family's reputation, and though the road remained long, there was, in her careful presence at the wedding, a small sign that the lesson Aliner had once spoken had, eventually, found its mark. Lena, standing beside her husband as the sun set golden over Belmore's rooftops, found her gaze drifting more than once toward the small stone house at the edge of the square, the modest home where an ordinary afternoon of kindness had quietly reshaped the entire course of her life. She thought of the frightened old woman she had helped to her feet that day, of the tea shared in comfortable silence, of every moment since that had led, improbably and wonderfully, to this one. "What are you thinking?" Julian asked, noticing the thoughtful softness in her expression. "That I very nearly walked past that fountain without stopping," Lena said. "If I had been a moment later reaching my stall, or a moment more hesitant about stepping forward, none of this would have happened." "But you did stop," Julian said, taking her hand. "You always do. It is, I have come to believe, simply who you are." Lena smiled, leaning into him as the music swelled once more around them, the town of Belmore alive with warmth and celebration beneath the fading light. Whatever trials had led them to this moment, whatever danger and cruelty had tried to unravel what began as a single, simple act of kindness, none of it had succeeded in the end. Kindness, freely given and asking nothing in return, had proven itself, in the truest sense, the strongest thread of all. 2 years passed, and the fountain in Belmore's Market Square had become something of a quiet landmark, not for any grand monument raised beside it, but for the small wooden bench Lena had insisted on placing nearby, a simple, unremarkable seat where anyone weary or in need of a moment's rest could sit without judgment or question. It had started as a private gesture, something she asked Nathan to build in the months following her marriage, and it had grown, without any deliberate planning, into a quiet symbol the townsfolk of Belmore had come to call, affectionately, the Kindness Bench. Lena visited it often, even after her days grew fuller with new responsibilities at Ashcombe, slipping away from estate matters whenever she could manage it to walk the familiar streets of the town that had shaped her. It was there, on a warm afternoon in early summer, that she found herself sitting beside a young woman she did not recognize, newly arrived in Belmore and struggling, it seemed, with the particular loneliness of a stranger in an unfamiliar place. "You look as though you could use a friendly face," Lena said gently, settling onto the bench beside her. The young woman glanced up, startled, then offered a tired, grateful smile. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who remembers what it feels like," Lena said. "I promise, this town is kinder than it sometimes appears at first glance." They talked for a while, of small things, much as Lena and Aliner once had in a modest kitchen years before, and by the time the young woman rose to continue on her way, some of the weariness had eased from her shoulders, replaced by the quiet reassurance of having been genuinely seen by someone who asked for nothing in return. It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone passing by. But Lena had come to understand, more deeply with each passing year, how much weight small moments like that one could carry. Eleanor, now more frail than she had been on that first fateful afternoon, but no less sharp in mind or spirit, had taken to spending her mornings in the gardens of Ashcombe, often joined by Lena, who found in those quiet hours a comfort she had not expected to feel so completely within the walls of a household so far removed from her own modest beginnings. "You have built something rather remarkable in that town," Eleanor said one such morning, watching Lena tend carefully to a bed of late-blooming flowers. "That bench of yours. Julian tells me half the market square has adopted the habit of pausing there, if only for a moment, simply to breathe." "It isn't much," Lena said, though there was quiet pride beneath her modesty. "Just a place to sit." "It is considerably more than that, and you know it," Eleanor said. "A place to sit without being asked to explain oneself, without needing to prove one's worth before being shown a moment's kindness. That is rarer than most people realize, and you have given it to an entire town." Lena smiled, brushing soil from her hands. "I suppose I learned, from a woman I met on a market bench myself once, that such gestures matter more than they seem to at first." Eleanor's eyes softened at the memory, though her expression carried none of the old sorrow that had once lived behind her careful composure. "I am a fortunate woman," she said quietly. "Fortunate to have found, so late in my life, a daughter I never expected and a peace I had long since stopped hoping to feel." Julian's rule over the province, in the years following the tribunal that had ended the Rutherford and Haldon conspiracies, grew known for a fairness that had not always characterized the household before him, a shift that those closest to the family understood, without needing it spoken aloud, had begun the day his mother wandered into a crowded market square in disguise, and found herself defended by a stranger who asked for nothing in return. He established, at Lena's quiet urging, a formal means by which merchants across the province could report unfair pressure from wealthier trading houses, a protection that had not existed before, and that spared countless smaller businesses the kind of quiet ruin the Doyle bakery had so nearly suffered. Camille Rutherford, for her part, had spent the years rebuilding her family, standing through considerably more honest means than her father had ever employed, taking over what remained of the family's modest trading interests, and running them with a careful integrity that surprised, and eventually won over, much of the town that had once regarded her with wary suspicion. She and Lena were never close, exactly, the wounds of that first difficult season too deep to fully smooth away, but a quiet, civil respect had grown between them over time, the kind that comes from watching someone genuinely change rather than merely apologize. Edgar Rutherford himself lived out his remaining years in considerably diminished circumstances, stripped of the influence that had once defined him, and though he never fully reconciled himself to the loss, he also never again attempted to reach for power through the kind of cruelty that had cost him everything. Lord Haldon's family, similarly humbled, retreated from provincial politics altogether, their ambitions curbed permanently by the Crown's continued oversight of their lands. On a quiet evening in early autumn, nearly 3 years after that first chaotic afternoon in the market square, Lena stood once more beside the fountain, her young daughter, barely old enough to walk steadily, clutching tightly at her hand, while Julian looked on with the same quiet warmth that had grown only deeper with each passing season. The little girl, named Eleanor after her grandmother, toddled unsteadily toward the wooden bench nearby, drawn by simple curiosity, and Lena knelt beside her, watching as small fingers traced the worn, smooth wood. "This is where it all began," Lena told her softly, though the child was far too young to understand the words. "Right here by this fountain." "She'll understand the story soon enough," Julian said, settling beside them, his hand resting warm against Lena's shoulder. "And I suspect, knowing my mother, she will insist on telling it herself at length, with considerably more embellishment than either of us would manage." Lena laughed, the sound carrying easily across the familiar square, mingling with the ordinary noise of market stalls and passing footsteps, the same square where a single moment of instinctive kindness had once set an entire chain of events into motion, reshaping not only her own life, but the lives of everyone it had touched along the way. She thought sometimes of how close it had all come to never happening at all, how easily she might have looked away that afternoon, might have let the crowd's uneasy silence swallow her own instinct to step forward. She was endlessly grateful that she had not, grateful for the frightened old woman who had turned out to be so much more than she first appeared, grateful for a kindness given freely that had returned to her, in the years since, 100-fold over. The sun set slowly over Belmore, gilding the fountain and the worn wooden bench beside it in soft evening light, and Lena remained there a while longer, her small family close around her, before turning at last toward the road home, carrying with her the quiet certainty that some of the truest changes in the world begin not with grand gestures or careful planning, but with a single, simple choice to stop, to notice, and to help.